There is a specific kind of respect that only exists between warriors. It doesn't come from admiration from a distance. It doesn't come from reading about someone in a history book or watching a documentary. It comes from standing next to a man in the worst possible conditions, watching him make decisions under pressure that you yourself were not sure you could make, and realizing in real time that what you are witnessing is operating at a frequency you have never encountered before. That moment happened in Fallujah. It happened between two groups of Marines who shared the same name, wore similar uniforms, spoke the same language, and had trained for the same kind of war. And yet, when they finally stood side by side in the most brutal urban battle since Hue City in Vietnam, one group watched the other and went quiet in a way that veterans almost never go quiet. This is that story. You need to understand something before we go any further. The Battle of Fallujah in November 2004, Operation Phantom Fury, was not a conventional military engagement. It was something closer to a controlled descent into hell. Fallujah had been transformed over months into a fortress. Every street was a potential kill zone. Every building had been reinforced, booby-trapped, connected by tunnels, and prepared by fighters who had no intention of retreating and no fear of dying. The U.S. Marines who were ordered to take that city knew what they were walking into. They had been trained extensively for urban warfare. They were some of the finest infantry fighters in the world. And they still understood, on the morning of November 8, 2004, that what was ahead of them was going to test every single thing they had ever been taught about how to fight and stay alive. Now you need to understand who the British Royal Marines are, because the answer is not what most people expect. When Americans hear the word Marines, they think of the United States Marine Corps, the largest and most powerful amphibious force in the history of warfare. And that association is entirely justified. But the British Royal Marines are something different in character, different in doctrine, and different in the specific type of warfare they were designed for. The Royal Marines Commandos are not simply a British version of the US Marines. They are the product of a tradition of warfare that goes back to the 17th century. A tradition that was forged not in large conventional battles, but in raids, insertions, unconventional engagements, and the kind of small unit operations that require individual Marines to make command-level decisions without any command present to make them. The commando course that produces Royal Marines is, at 32 weeks, one of the longest initial military training programs in the world for infantry. The final tests, the commando tests, include a 9-mile speed march, a Tarzan assault course, a 6-mile endurance course through mud and water, and a 30-mile load carry across Dartmoor, all completed within strict time limits, all completed after months of progressive training that has already eliminated the majority of candidates who started. But the physical demands are not what define a Royal Marines commando. What defines him is a doctrine of thinking. From the first week of training, Royal Marines are taught that the plan will fail, that the situation will change, and that the man on the ground must be capable of making the right decision without waiting for permission. That doctrine has a name inside the Royal Marines. They call it commando thinking, and in the streets of Fallujah, the US Marines were about to watch it operate in real time. The British contingent that operated alongside US forces during and around the Battle of Fallujah was not large in number. That is precisely what makes what they did so significant. A small number of Royal Marines commandos, embedded with and operating in coordination with US Marine units, became a reference point that American veterans would return to in interviews and memoirs for years afterward, not because of any single dramatic act of heroism, though there were moments of extraordinary courage, but because of something harder to quantify and harder to forget. The way they moved, the way they communicated, the way they processed information under fire, and translated that information into action with a speed and a fluidity that seemed to belong to a different category of warfare entirely. One U.S. Marine veteran, in an interview conducted years after the battle, described watching a Royal Marines commando team clear a building under fire. He said the first thing he noticed was the silence, not the absence of gunfire, the absence of unnecessary communication. The U.S. doctrine for building clearance involves a specific sequence of verbal commands, confirmations, and acknowledgements designed to maintain coordination and reduce friendly fire incidents. It is effective, it is tested, it saves lives, but it produces a certain volume of communication that becomes part of the background noise of the operation. The Royal Marines team he watched used almost none of it. They moved through the building like a single organism with multiple bodies, each man anticipating the position and intention of every other man without being told, without confirming, without the verbal scaffolding that the American had been trained to consider essential. When it was over, in less time than he expected, he said he stood at the entry point and could not immediately find words for what he had just watched. To understand why that silence in communication was possible, you need to understand something about how the Royal Marines train for exactly this scenario. The British military, and the Royal Marines in particular, use a concept borrowed from military philosophy called mission command, or in its German original form, Auftragstaktik. The principle is straightforward in theory and extraordinarily difficult to execute in practice. A commander gives his subordinates the objective and the intent. He tells them what needs to be achieved and why it needs to be achieved. He does not tell them how to achieve it. The how is left entirely to the man on the ground, who has information the commander does not have, who can see things the commander cannot see, and who must therefore be trusted completely to make the right decisions in real time without reference upward. This is not a new concept. The German military used it to devastating effect in both world wars. The Israeli Defense Forces built much of their operational culture around it. But in practice, truly implementing mission command requires something that is very difficult to manufacture. A level of trust between individuals that goes deep enough that a man will act decisively on his own judgment, even when the consequences of being wrong are catastrophic. The Royal Marines build that trust not through team-building exercises or motivational frameworks, but through shared suffering over a long period of time. By the time two Royal Marines commandos are operating together in a combat environment, they have been through enough together that the communication between them has compressed into something closer to instinct than language. They do not need to say what they are going to do because the other man already knows, because he would do the same thing, because they were forged in the same process and came out with the same reflexes. There was a second thing the U.S. Marines noticed, and it was something that took longer to articulate, but stayed with them longer. It was the British relationship with chaos. Urban warfare in Fallujah was chaos in its most concentrated form. Streets that appeared on maps did not exist as drawn. Buildings that were supposed to be empty were occupied. Plans that had been rehearsed the night before became irrelevant within the first hour of execution. The U.S. Marines were trained to adapt to this, and they did adapt, because they are exceptional fighters with exceptional training. But adaptation still implies a starting point of order, that then becomes disorder, a plan that then requires modification, a structure that then requires improvisation. The Royal Marines seem to operate from a different starting assumption entirely. They did not appear to begin with order and then adapt to chaos. They appeared to begin with chaos as the baseline and build from there, as if disorder was not a problem to be solved, but simply the medium in which they operated, like fish that don't notice water, because water is all they have ever known. A U.S. Marine officer who worked closely with Royal Marines elements during that period said something in a recorded interview that has stayed in the memory of everyone who heard it. He said, "They were never surprised, not because nothing surprised them, but because they had already accounted for being surprised. The surprise was already in the plan." That sentence, when you think about it long enough, describes a fundamentally different relationship with uncertainty than the one most military training systems produce. Most training systems try to reduce uncertainty by increasing preparation. The Royal Marines approach, at its deepest level, tries to increase the operator's comfort with uncertainty to the point where uncertainty itself stops being a variable that affects performance. There is a specific engagement that veterans of Fallujah have referenced, without full operational details for obvious reasons, where a joint US and British element encountered a situation that had not been anticipated and that required immediate decisions with incomplete information and no time for consultation. What happened next, according to the Americans who were present, was that the Royal Marines Commando element assessed, decided, and acted within a window of time that the American veterans described as, and this is a direct quote from one of them, "before we had finished understanding what was happening." The outcome of that decision was correct. The position was secured. But what stayed with the Americans was not the outcome. It was the speed of the process that produced the outcome, the absence of hesitation. Not recklessness, because there was nothing reckless about what they saw, but the clean, uncluttered movement from perception to decision to action that left no space for doubt to insert itself. One veteran tried to explain it this way. He said that in his training he had been taught that the decision cycle under fire moves through 4 stages: observe, orient, decide, act. The OODA loop, developed by military strategist John Boyd, is one of the foundational frameworks of modern military decision-making. He said that watching the Royal Marines in Fallujah was like watching men who had compressed the 4 stages into something that felt like one, as if the observation, the orientation, the decision, and the action had collapsed into a single continuous movement with no visible joints between them. After Fallujah, in the conversations that happen between warriors when the fighting is done and the processing begins, several US Marines described a feeling that was difficult to name. It was not inadequacy. They had fought well. They had taken a fortified city against determined defenders at enormous cost and had prevailed. It was not jealousy, because the admiration they felt for what they had witnessed was genuine and without resentment. The feeling was closer to something that happens when you have been practicing a craft for years and then encounter someone who practices the same craft at a level that reveals, gently but undeniably, that there are dimensions of that craft you had not yet discovered. You are not diminished. Your own skill is not reduced, but the ceiling you thought existed has been removed, and the space above it is larger and more complex than you knew. That is a gift, even when it is uncomfortable. Because once you have seen that the ceiling is higher than you thought, you cannot unsee it. And the best warriors, the ones who go back and train harder and think deeper and question every assumption, are the ones who take that discomfort and turn it into direction. Several US Marines who served in Fallujah and had close contact with Royal Marines elements went on to become some of the most innovative thinkers in US military doctrine over the following decade. Not all of them would tell you directly that what they saw in Fallujah was the catalyst, but the timeline is not a coincidence. There is a final dimension to this story that almost never appears in the military analysis, but that is perhaps the most important of all, for understanding why what happened in Fallujah mattered beyond the battle itself. The British Royal Marines and the US Marines shared something that most people overlook when they analyze the differences between the two forces. They shared a complete commitment to the mission, a willingness to die for the objective, and a code of conduct that placed the man beside you above everything else. That foundation was identical. And yet the expression of that foundation in combat was different enough that veterans who saw both operating simultaneously described the experience as seeing 2 versions of the same language, one of which had developed vocabulary and grammatical structures that the other had not yet found. That is not a critique of the US Marines. It is a description of what happens when 2 great institutions, built on the same values, make different choices over decades about which skills to prioritize, which doctrines to emphasize, and which assumptions about combat to build their training around. Both choices produced exceptional warriors. Both choices produced men who performed extraordinary acts under conditions that would destroy most human beings. But one set of choices produced something in Fallujah that the other set of choices had not yet produced. And the men who were present when those two sets of choices met in the same burning street, in the same urban nightmare, in the same moment of maximum pressure, knew they were seeing something they needed to remember. They remembered. And now, so will you.